The epidermis is the most superficial layer of skin or the cutaneous membrane. As I've mentioned before, I like to call it the hard candy shell. And it's important to use terms like superficial and deep instead of saying outside, inside, top, or bottom. Remember, try to use the correct regional and anatomical terms when referring to organs. So up here is superficial. This is the outside of skin. And down here is deep. Okay. This red line in the picture separates the epidermis from the dermis. So it's not a straight line. It is this wavy line like this. Also, purple stained cells here are dead, whereas the darkly purple stained cells here are alive. So these are alive, and these are dead. However, both swaths of purple belong to the epidermis. The dermis is composed of the pinkish colored tissue, which is collagen. Cells of the epidermis are squamous shaped, which is that shape like a fried egg. And if you were to zoom in on this area right here, you would definitely see the fried egg shape of those cells. So when viewed superficially, these cells look like your body is covered with little tiny eggs. If we make a cut into the body, such as the picture here, these squamous or egg-shaped cells look more like the shape of an eye or almost an almond. Take a step back. Think about looking at an egg from the top down or cutting it and looking at it from the side. Whenever we talk about epithelial tissues or tissues that lie in an open space, we always have to give the cells a name about their shape, which here is squamous. But we also have to give the cells a designation of whether they have one or many layers. Here, the squamous cells are in many layers, like 40 of them. And the many layers allow these cells to suffer the abrasion of the external environment and not compromise the integrity of the cutaneous membrane. I can lose these cells right here, and my skin's not going to fall apart. Because these layers are most superficial, they contain a protein called keratin. And because these stratified squamous cells make the protein keratin, they can also be referred to as keratinocytes. Keratin is a waterproofing protein. Losing the epidermis in a second or third degree burn removes the cutaneous membrane's ability to stop water loss from the dermis. This waterproofing and the cells that make it are completely removed in a second or a third degree burn. Let's just take a look at the 5 layers that make up the epidermis. I have taught from a book that called these layers. However, in the most recent book that I've taught from, it calls these strata, which is a word that just means layers, and the words stratum, which just means singular layer. Doesn't really matter what you call them, layers or strata, doesn't matter. The deepest layer is called the stratum basale, and it is only one line of cells, just one line of cells that border on the dermis. There are various kinds of cells that are here in the stratum basale, but the most abundant are stem cells that are doing mitosis very rapidly. And by doing so, they are creating new keratinocytes, which are epidermal cells, very deep in the cutaneous membrane. These newly formed keratinocytes will move superficially, die, and get sloughed off. As you can see up here at the top of this diagram that says dead cell, you can kind of see it like tearing off. So the epidermis is kind of like a conveyor belt, generating new cells in the stratum basale and then moving them superficially and sloughing them off. The stratum spinosum, which I think is better seen on microscopic pictures, it's, you know, some books say it's 2 to 3 layers thick. Some say it's 3 to 5 cells thick. You know what? In essence, it is less than 10 cells thick. So here in the stratum spinosum, the keratinocytes they're actually bound to each other. And if we were to enhance upon the stratum spinosum, we would see these prickly or thorny little attachment points between all the cells. In fact, the word spinosum means spiny or thorny. The stratum granulosum is superficial to the stratum spinosum, and you can sense a little bit of a lighter purple color in the stratum granulosum. The cells in the granulosum are becoming flattened in their shape. These cells are also still alive, however, but they're starting to become cut off from the glucose and oxygen in the blood vessels in the dermis. The appearance of the cells in the stratum granulosum is called granular because basically the melanosomes, which are little vesicles containing melanin, and the keratinosomes, which are little vesicles containing keratin, those vesicles in the cytoplasm of the cells are starting to explode, and they give the cell a grainy or sandy appearance. The stratum lucidum is only in thick skin on the soles of your feet and palms of your hand. And so this is kind of like the 5th layer of keratinocytes that epidermis can have. I know it's the 4th that we're covering here, but we kind of refer to it as the 5th layer because it's not present in all areas of skin. The stratum lucidum is, I don't care what this picture shows you, because I stole this picture from somewhere, but the stratum lucidum is really only one layer of cells thick, and it is also incredibly darkly colored. The cells here are they're bursting apart in the lucidum, and they're releasing that purple stain, and they're making a line of pretty darkly stained matrix. Superficial to the stratum lucidum is the stratum corneum, which is 30 to 50 cells thick, and these cells are all dead. They're flattened, they have no nucleus, their organelles are gone, and they take up a whole bunch of that stain because and especially in those cells that's starting to slough off. I disagree with this picture because it kind of shows you the cells sloughing off individually, and that's not true. At the point that they get to the most superficial surface, some of those desmosomes are still binding the cells together, but yes, many of them have already broken down. As you can see from this picture, if the epidermis has all 5 layers, we call that thick skin. And thick skin is present on your palms and your feet, which are the 2 areas that receive the most abrasion as you navigate the external environment. Thin skin is everywhere else on your cutaneous membrane, and it only contains 4 of the 5 layers that the epidermis can have. The difference in thickness between thin and thick skin is similar to the difference between the thickness of a plastic bag and a paper towel. And although your brain can sense the thickness between these 2 things, and in fact it is those mechanoreceptors like Merkel cells and tactile discs that are able to sense the difference in these 2, it's always very difficult for our brains to perceive or apply an understanding to the difference between these 2 thicknesses because, they are so alike. So the hills and valleys that you see where the epidermis contacts the dermis, those hills and valleys have 2 very important functions. Number 1, I just had to think for a moment I'm kidding. Instead of a straight line as the border between the epidermis and the dermis, these ridges or epidermal ridges, they create more surface area for exchange. And this is really important because the epidermis is avascular, meaning that there are no blood vessels in it. Therefore, if any of the cells in the epidermis want nutrients, such as glucose and oxygen, the glucose and oxygen needs to move from deep to superficial by way of diffusion for those keratinocytes of the epidermis to receive it. This diffusion takes the nutrients only so far into the epidermis, and that leaves a whole bunch of keratinocytes in the strata corneum, lucidum, and granulosum. It leaves those cells in those layers cut off from nutrients. And this is why those cells die, and they're flat, and they take up less purple stain. They lack the organelles in the nucleus to take up the stain. So even though the epidermis is avascular, it relies on the dermis for oxygen and nutrients. The other really important function is attachment. The epidermis and the dermis are like wearing two body stockings, I guess. If you want them to move together so that they're not rubbing past each other, they need to have a tight attachment point. When you buy new sneakers for the gym, and I'm not saying that I did this, we'll just call it a friend of mine. When you buy new sneakers for the gym, it's really natural to tie the sneakers too tightly for the first time. And this creates a situation where the dermis is attached to your hypodermis, and the epidermis is actually more attached to your shoe than it is to the deep dermis below it. And the epidermis starts to detach more and more and more from the dermis. And as it does that, a fluid-filled bubble. Here, wait, let me draw you a fluid-filled, right? Here's a fluid-filled bubble starts to get created between the epidermis and the dermis. And this is a blister. A blister is created, anywhere in your body, but it's created as two layers move past each other, right? They create friction. And when there's friction, we send fluid there to lubricate the area. So this bubble, it's a bubble of serous fluid, and it's a blister. Just next time, put some tape on the back of your heel when you wear new sneakers. Again, the surface area expanded by those epidermal ridges, it provides more surface against which the two layers can attach. Now, these epidermal ridges, they end up creating ridges on the surface of your skin that you may not be able to feel, but definitely leave a distinctive mark. And this is your fingerprint. Your fingerprint is basically determined by the attachment points of your epidermis to your dermis.